Good morning and welcome to our broadcast today, an interview with Mike Stone. We're glad to have him joining us today, and we're going to jump right into a conversation with Pastor Mike. For those of you who don't know, Pastor Mike is pastor. He's been 21 years coming up this next week at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Blackshear, Georgia. He is now being nominated for the second time for the SBC President role, and we look forward to him being able to give us some insight about his nomination and what he seeks to accomplish and how we can move forward. So, Mike, we're glad to have you joining us today.
Well, Brother Bobby, it's a privilege to be with you. I'm so thankful for your ministry, and it's a joy to communicate with our Southern Baptist family today.
Absolutely. Well, we are glad to have you joining us today. We would say just here starting out, if you have questions, we're going to try to entertain some of those questions in real time. So you can type those into the comments, and then we'll go through and screen those and ask some of those so Pastor Mike can respond to those just kind of in real time as we go. As we get going, we do have some other questions we'd like to go ahead and jump into. And Pastor Mike, since most of our viewers will probably already have some idea, know you some, one either from your former kind of national political run with the SBC or some of the other roles you have served. Let's jump right into some of the questions. To start with, the first thing I wanted to ask is the SBC, has gotten a lot of attention from the DOJ now. Can you please comment on the significance of that investigation on the SBC?
Well, absolutely. I don't know how you would describe it with anything other than words like monumental, historic, unprecedented, words of that nature when you're describing the largest non-Catholic convention of churches on the North American continent being under criminal investigation by the federal government, by the Department of Justice. The reason that I think that this is such a challenge for us as Southern Baptists is not merely because of just the fact that the DOJ is investigating us, but they're investigating us in part because of what I believe are unwise decisions that have been made by leaders at the highest level in the Southern Baptist Convention. The bottom line, I believe that we allowed ourselves a few years ago to be deceived and misled by secular media, social media, and a disgruntled former SBC entity president to believe that there was even the potential that the executive committee on the whole was engaged in some systemic cover-up of sexual abuse. I would point out that when you portray that idea to the world, don't be surprised when the criminal justice system comes knocking at your door. The fact that there has not been any evidence that I have ever seen that the executive committee covered up a single case of sexual abuse only makes these unwise actions of our leadership that much more unacceptable. I would also point out, and Bobby, we may get into a few follow-up questions on this, we are spending ourselves to the brink of financial insolvency at the executive committee specifically because of the millions and millions of dollars that we are spending to deal with this situation, the Guidepost report, litigation and legal fees coming out of that, and the huge amounts of money that we are spending to cooperate, as we should be cooperating with the investigation by the DOJ. I just think that it's unwise decisions that led to the DOJ investigation from the very beginning.
Well, what do you think, since we're on the topic of the sexual abuse crisis, what do you think are our primary concerns at this juncture related to that crisis?
Well, first of all, when you speak about this, I want to speak with grace and compassion. Bobby, I think you and a lot of your viewers are well aware that I suffered abuse of this nature from age 8 to age 10. I never shared that with anyone for 40 years. I shared it publicly in the February 2019 meeting of the Executive Committee, in part to communicate to Southern Baptists and to survivors of sexual abuse that I understand these issues both procedurally and personally. Sex abuse, anytime we describe it and talk about it, I think we should be quick to say what a horrible thing that is it is not only wicked and vile and sinful. We couldn't say enough unkind descriptions from a theological and biblical perspective about sexual abuse, but obviously it's certainly criminal activity, and we should encourage anyone who has the slightest suspicion or report of someone being abused sexually, they should immediately call 911 and they should report that to investigators. The challenge that I have, however, is not in the acknowledging that sexual abuse has occurred in churches that are in cooperation with the SBC. Obviously, that's a fact. It happens all across our country. Sex abuse is a reality. It is a danger that any congregation faces. And being in affiliation with the SBC certainly does not immunize or exempt you from that. And when that sexual abuse has occurred, almost by definition, it involves a cover-up of some kind. If by no one else, by the perpetrator, by the criminal predator who has abused that person. And oftentimes in churches, we've seen indication where other leaders around that situation become aware of it. And I believe that sinfully, and should even be criminally, have covered that up, and they have allowed perhaps the perpetrator to slip away quietly so as to not damage the reputation of that congregation. They allow, a staff member to resign and go to another church without telling anybody the circumstances that were known perhaps to just one or two people. So I want to begin by saying I do not deny at all that sexual abuse is a reality, that it's a real and vital concern for our churches. I don't deny at all that cover-ups have happened. The question, though, is who covered it up and who is responsible for that? And through actions that we have taken at the national level, including statements of repentance, statements of regret, statements that in essence claim a negligence to protect individuals in the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. Last year in Anaheim, there was a resolution that was passed that had language of this nature. I think that it is a misstep, both financially, legally, and ecclesiologically, that the Southern Baptist Convention at the national level, or the SBC Executive Committee, also our national board of directors, would be claiming responsibility of some kind, claiming a collective responsibility, even for egregious acts of abuse that occurred in the individual, independent, autonomous churches, just because they happen to be in cooperation with the SBC. I don't think that is a convention responsibility from a financial, legal, or ecclesiological matter. That is not to say, and I'll share this, and you may have some follow-up questions. That is not to say that there are not things that we can improve upon. Better training, better resourcing, better communication. I am actually in favor, and have been, I'm in favor of a published database for those who are convicted sex offenders, or for those who have confessed in some type of privileged setting. For example, in many of our states, the statute of limitations may have expired by the time a victim comes forward, and there may be a civil litigation. That person may confess in a civil setting, or perhaps in an interview they confess, but because of the statute of limitations, they may never face criminal prosecution, and therefore would never be on a convicted offender registry list that the government puts out. I am all in favor of communicating more clearly. If we know that there's a graduate of one of our seminaries, someone that was ever a volunteer or an employee, a staff member, or a pastor in one of the churches of the SBC, I am all in favor where we have documentation from other finders of fact that we just have a centrally located database of people that we know to be connected with the SBC who are proven either by a criminal court or by their own confession to have been engaged in sexual abuse. That's just one of the ways that I think we can improve the information we're providing to our churches, that churches can then use to fulfill the responsibilities of that local congregation.
Hey, let's back up just a second and dig down just a little bit on some of what you said. One of the things that's confused me a little bit about the way this is kind of developed in time goes back to our just SBC polity. And we are not a denomination in that sense. Correct. Of denominations being a convention of cooperative churches. Mm-hmm. And each church is autonomous. Each association, state convention are autonomous. And one side of this argument have debated that that's a scapegoat. That's just an excuse. And that really shouldn't make any difference, that the national entities should be held accountable. Just this week, in fact, I had a pastor call me, and he and his leadership, particularly one man in his church, had brought this to his attention are extremely concerned about their liability in their church, their individual church in North Georgia, about their liability if something happens in, a sex abuse case happens in a church nearby them, or even somewhere in Wyoming, Idaho, or Salt Lake City, that it's all going to be tied together because they're part of the cooperating group known as Southern Baptist, and that could come back and hurt them in some way or another. The other side obviously says, but every entity and church are autonomous, and it ought to be handled locally, whether it be in one of our entities at a seminary, or one of our other entities, or that local church, and taken to the proper authorities, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see that playing out? I mean, why is there such confusion among some about how this really, the responsibility really should play out?
Well, for starters, there's not a lot of knowledge or understanding, even by some pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention, as to how our polity actually works. You are exactly right, but I want to reiterate that every Baptist church is autonomous. I had a pastor call me a couple of months ago who was really upset with some of these directional issues. He said he was considering taking his church to be an independent Baptist church. I know what he meant by that, but the fact of the matter is my church, which is in affiliation with our local association, our state convention here in Georgia, and the SBC, we are every bit as independent and autonomous as any church that would moniker itself as an independent Baptist church. But as you stated, each of those areas of Baptist life are also autonomous in their own sphere. My church is autonomous. My association is itself autonomous. It's autonomous and free from the state and national conventions, and they from it. And so where I think we need to find the balance here is looking at liability and responsibility being at that local church level. What we should then take on a responsibility for at the associational, state, and national level is exercising our own autonomy by determining what churches can be considered to be in fellowship, or we use the phrase in friendly cooperation with the SBC. Now, just to give you a specific example, I believe that if sexual abuse is alleged or accused to have occurred in a local church, the leaders in that church who become aware of that accusation should immediately contact law enforcement. Here in our community, I could call 911, but I'm in a small community. I have the police chief and the sheriff in my phone. And I could have the little lady in my phone call them and get them on the phone within a matter of seconds. So immediately call the police, cooperate with them fully. Let the government, let properly trained law enforcement come in and investigate the criminal aspects of what's going on there. Let the police do the job that they have been commissioned, not only by the Constitution and jurisdictional laws, but our law enforcement, they've been commissioned by God. If we understand Romans 13 and other related passages, they don't bear the sword for nothing. So let them come in and do the job that they have been called, commissioned, trained, and equipped to do. Let them and our court system be the finders of fact. I do not believe that a 9-member committee, make the committee as large as you want to, but right now our credentials committee is a 9-member committee. I don't think that 9-member credentials committee has any business trying to be a finder of fact as to what may or may not have happened criminally in some incident that most of the time, by the time it gets to that committee table, it happened, the allegation is years old. The question that should be before the Southern Baptist Convention in this case, I'd say the same thing at the associational and state or regional convention level, but the question should not be that we try to determine what happened in terms of did the abuse actually happen, but what did the church do? How did the church respond based on information that was known and available, proven, known and available to the church at the time that the accusation was made? And Brother Bobby, I am fully in support of disfellowshipping churches where we can determine at the convention level that that church was aware that abuse had occurred. That church was aware that their pastoral candidate, for example, was a convicted sex offender, and they chose to call him anyway. And again, that's just an illustration where somebody else has been a finder of fact. And the question before our national convention should be, given the facts that were known and available to the church at that time, have they acted in a way that we, in the autonomy of the Southern Baptist Convention, determined that they are no longer should be deemed to be in friendly cooperation with the SBC. I was the chairman of the executive committee when we reformed this latest iteration of our credentials committee, turned it into a standing committee through a revision of Bylaw 8. I was one of the primary authors of Bylaw 8. I served on the first year of that credentials committee. And because of that, I'm one of only a handful of people in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention that has actually made a motion to disfellowship a church on this very basis. And as the then chairman of the executive committee, I shepherded that motion from the credentials committee back to the EC. And during my time, we disfellowshipped some of those churches. So I'm all in favor of the convention removing churches from our midst. I'm not in favor of anything that looks like the Southern Baptist Convention being involved in trying to validate or conduct some kind of criminal inquiry to determine what happened in a setting that is way beyond our ability and is certainly beyond our authority to do so.
Well, and now the legal issues have been risen as survivors are starting to sue the SBC again. And I know a lot of pastors and church members are not aware that the SBC at the national level gets sued a lot, whether they know that or not, because lawyers go after the deep pockets, obviously, and they don't understand the polity. And so I've been friends with several of the legal representatives at the EC over the years, and you know, they just basically have, you know, kind of, I hate to call it a form letter, but there's basic things you put in the template of a letter that says, look, we're autonomous organizations, and there's not a liability there. But you know, the water has really been muddied recently, at least in the last couple of years, especially once the Guidestone report came out. Now, I want you to comment real quickly on the controversy of the EC using Guidestone Solutions in this sexual abuse process and how that has really muddied the water some way, because you've got the alignment with the Guidestone organization with a very, very non-biblical approaches to things. They're a legal firm. It's not like a church, obviously. But there's an alignment there that people are very uncomfortable with, not to mention some of the things that were done and the way, you know, some people were, I'll call it outed or whatever in some ways, even without documentation, it seems. But comment on that for us.
Yeah, well, first of all, you've said Guidestone a number of times, and we know it's Guidepost. And I say that.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
I say that because I will be just as likely as a Southern Baptist. I'll be just as likely to say Guidestone myself. But we know we're talking about Guidepost Solutions. I think it is egregiously unacceptable that we have continued to move forward partnering with a leftist corporation that supports sexual perversion. Southern Baptists were shocked and very concerned going into the Anaheim Convention last year. As most of your viewers will remember, at the beginning of Pride Month, as the LGBTQIA plus community calls the month of June, Guidepost Solutions put out a tweet in which they expressed their support for that. That was far enough ahead of the Anaheim Convention last year that I thought it sure seemed to me to be the overwhelming consensus of Southern Baptist messengers in Anaheim that we did not want to continue to partner with Guidepost Solutions. That honestly, Brother Bobby, back in February of this year, when the task force chairman, Brother Marshall Blaylock, announced to the executive committee that they were going to be recommending to the credentials committee to engage in yet another contract with Guidepost Solutions, that announcement was really one of the two primary things that the Lord used to begin pricking my heart to allow my name to be placed back in nomination. At the time, I wrote that it was a bridge too far for Southern Baptists to think that we're going to partner with a leftist corporation that itself obviously doesn't even recognize what sexual perversion is. I'm talking scripturally, just bottom line, Bible 101's human sexuality. That we would partner with a corporation that itself does not understand human sexuality and perversion to come in and assist us in dealing with issues of sexual perversion. This is aside from the fact that I could tell you personally, having been falsely named and mischaracterized in the Guidepost report. I believe that that corporation, because of the strain and stream of American culture from which they come, often seem to be more concerned about being trauma informed than being truth informed. That report has a lot of hearsay, a lot of secondhand evidence. It has a lot of information that would never pass a standard to even be presented in a civil case. And for those who follow these issues, our own convention leadership recently put in a motion to have themselves dismissed from a case, in part because they acknowledge that there's the Guidepost report has a lot of hearsay evidence in it. I think we should be deeply troubled that we have allowed our leadership to put us in this kind of position. And I would say, I want to say it lovingly but clearly, when the Guidepost, when it was announced that we're going to have another contract with Guidepost yet again, one of the biggest defenders of that was our current president. Bart Barber went on Twitter and vehemently defended that position. I would also say that it's fair that the task force that made this recommendation is a presidentially appointed task force, and it is unilaterally appointed by this president. And according to Robert's Rules of Order, when the president appoints you, you serve at the will and good pleasure of the president. You can be removed by this president. And so you had the president going out and advocating for and supporting this position. And one of the things that we heard is that Guidepost Solutions is the only corporation in America that can meet the criteria that we set. And I'll quickly make
it large enough. I heard that. Yeah.
I'll make a couple of observations about that. It seems to me, and I'm a simple preacher, and I preach to simple people. I don't think this is rocket science. If out of all that's going on in the American culture, only one corporation can meet our criteria, we ought to be asking, is it possible that we allowed some influential figures in this discussion to help craft the criteria in a way that only one corporation could meet those criteria? I also want to say, as I said to my church leaders here, when you tell me that a corporation that supports the radical LGBTQIA plus agenda can still meet our criteria, we should be troubled that one of our criteria was not, don't use Southern Baptist mission money to support a radical sexual perverse agenda. We should be shocked that that wasn't on the list.
Right.
And I'll make one other observation. It is fair to acknowledge that the task force has more recently announced that they're reevaluating and reconsidering the partnership with Guidepost. First of all, Guidepost continues to operate the sex abuse hotline. And I've been told as recently as yesterday that we don't want to move away from that because it may make us look bad in the DOJ investigation that we've in some way taken that contract away from Guidepost.
Yeah.
Bobby, as a longtime Southern Baptist, you're probably well aware that when the Ohio State Convention and the Florida Baptist State Convention, one of our smaller state conventions, but one of our largest state conventions, when they announced that if we continue with this Guidepost contract, they would begin to reallocate and designate cooperative program money from the entire state convention so that none of it would be going to the executive committee to help pay for this contract with Guidepost. It was in light of that some of these conversations that maybe we'll back away from Guidepost a little bit. I was asked, don't you think they should get credit for that? And I want to say this, I want to say it kindly but clearly. No, I don't. Because when it takes that kind of unprecedented financial pressure to get leaders to make biblically wise, scripturally sustainable decisions about who we're going to be yoked up together with, I don't believe that someone should get some kind of credit because it should have never taken that amount of pressure to get the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention to say, we will not use Southern Baptist dollars to partner with a leftist corporation like Guidepost Solutions.
Yeah. Sometimes you think the best thing would be to take the Southern Baptist leaders, just put them in an 8x8 box with no other outside influences, and said, okay, now look at scripture and decide what is the biblical thing to do, because it seems like the lines between right and wrong have gotten really blurred in the minds of some of our leaders, and some of the things, ethical, moral. I mean, there's just lots of lines that seem to be having been crossed. And even, we'll talk about it maybe in a minute, but the allegations of corruption and other kinds of things that are present as well, something else. Well, look, let's wrap up on this topic real quickly with this. You've advocated for kind of a different approach to the sexual abuse crisis. Briefly explain what your approach you think would be.
Well, first of all, and I think this has to be first, is the way that we treat one another. There are vicious, vile, wicked, mean-spirited attacks across the aisle, so to speak, from people who hold different views in our approach. And I want to go on record, Brother Bobby, I have never, ever, ever accused some people who hold a different view of being unconcerned about children being molested in local church context. Mm-hmm. But I and others who say, we don't think that this is the wisest, most sustainable biblical approach. If you go out on SBC Twitter, we are accused of siding with pedophiles, suborning child molestation, and not being concerned about sexual abuse, including being accused of covering up that sexual abuse. And I want to say, as a survivor of sexual abuse, you could call me an awful lot of things that would not be any more wicked, any more vile, or any more untrue. We have got to be able to have an honest, Christ-like, brother-honoring, sister-honoring discussion without throwing these needless jabs at one another that you don't care about sexual abuse. So I think one of the things we've got to do, and from the office of president, I would seek to do this, is to tone down the rhetoric and to just get the best ideas to the table without name calling and without impugning someone's character or their integrity. I also believe that we have embraced a mantra, an atmosphere of believing all accusations and believing that those accusations should be considered true unless they are proven false. We even see some of that coming out of our own credentials committee, that an accusation is turned into the credentials committee, and then the church is expected to prove that that accusation is not true. It should not be the responsibility of the church to try to prove that something is not true. It should be the responsibility of those who are making the accusation to bring to the convention evidence, proof, documentation that the church has acted in an egregious way. This idea that we're going to believe all accusations is simply not a biblically sustainable, biblically supported position. I told our congregation here, and I reiterate this in the sex abuse prevention training we do in our church, the Word of God and biblical principles and the law require us to treat every accusation as potentially true, regardless of the identity of the accused, and regardless of the identity of the accuser. We will always, 100% of the time, immediately call the police. But the same Bible that would give us principles to say that we should treat every accusation as potentially true forbids us to treat every accusation as necessarily true. The Bible still says that the first to plead his case seems right until his neighbor comes to question him. The Bible still says that we're not to entertain an accusation against an elder except by 2 or 3 witnesses. So we've got to, first of all, treat one another better in our discourse. We've got to get away from this idea that we don't care about victims of abuse unless we believe every word that they say and require the accused person, or the accused church in this case, to prove that the accusations are false. I believe it is also a biblical matter. I've used the word ecclesiology, of course, the doctrine of the church. I believe that it is an ecclesiological matter, that we're going to take upon ourselves at the national level responsibility for things that happen in local churches, and thereby establishing a sense of hierarchy. We are not the Roman Catholic Church. We are not a denomination in the strictest sense of that word, but we are taking actions that even a mediocre attorney could tell you are establishing principles of ascending and descending liability. Not only should those be concerns that are both financial and legal in nature, but there are ecclesiological implications, and we have court cases working their way through the court systems now, not only amicus briefs, but actual filings by convention entities and convention lawyers, that they may not use the word hierarchy, although, Brother Bobby, I know that you know that a few of them have suggested that we are literally a hierarchy. But we've got other filings from convention leaders and convention attorneys that may not use the language of hierarchy, but they're making the very same case. This should be deeply, deeply troubling. We've got to move away from the idea that every accusation is true unless you can prove it false, and that the convention should take responsibility for things that occur by individual, independent, autonomous Southern Baptist congregations.
Yeah, and no, the reality is when you start looking at that again, I mean, we've got this mix, and that's always been somewhat of a debate among individuals sometimes about what the responsibilities really are when you understand our polity and the kind of the lack of hierarchy in that sense. But we've got court cases, like you just mentioned, ERLC and both NAMB, things filed with the Fifth Circuit, U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, things filed with the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, there are starting to be precedents that have been set where even our own entities are making the case that there is that connectionalism, I guess you could say, between them, meaning all entities that are a part of that kind of structure, however you want to diagram it, are all connected in some way or another. And that's a dangerous thing when you start looking at it that way, without a doubt.
And Bobby, there's a case that's not as well known, but it's a case in the state of Alabama. And convention leadership, convention attorneys, filed as part of their motion to dismiss the idea that they should be dismissed from that case because there's some type of ecclesiastical covering that apparently extends all the way from Nashville, Tennessee, the corporate headquarters of the executive committee. Of course, the convention is a Georgia corporation, but I'll just use the EC as an example, that there's some kind of ecclesiastical covering that extends all the way from Nashville, Tennessee, all the way to South Alabama. And that a person, even if they were defamed by the actions of the executive committee or the convention, has no legal recourse because they are up under this ecclesiastical covering. And as I read that, and I don't pretend to be a lawyer, but I know the meaning of words, that sounds like some type of hierarchical denominational situation of which the individual person was a part, and they have no redress because they're part of this hierarchical system. Those kinds of arguments should send chills up and down the spine of Southern Baptist individual members and of local congregations. We are headed toward the creation of the legal argument, not a legal reality, because the court can't create some reality that my church is part of a hierarchy. But the problem is, and where we're headed into uncharted waters, is when we make these arguments ourselves from convention attorneys or from entity attorneys, we now create questions of fact that have to be defended. You mentioned earlier in this interview that in days past, really in decades past, we had what essentially were form letters that would be sent as motions to be dismissed from court cases, everything from wrongful terminations to property disputes to slip and falls in local churches. And we would just essentially fill in the form letter and send it to the court of that jurisdiction and be, without question, dismissed from those cases because there was no question of fact. But we now have some people who would be opponents of the Southern Baptist Convention using our own filings against us, creating legal questions of fact that we've got to spend money to defend. And
and my understanding is that every time that happened, they never lost. I mean, it was always dismissed
until more recently.
Yep. Now let's look at another issue where we've got a national action being taken and it's impacting local churches, and that's the idea of disfellowshipping churches. Having a hard time this afternoon, aren't I? Disfellowshipping churches. And I want you, if you will, can you please describe for us, in your view, the controversy about women pastors and how we need to move forward? How do we move forward with this controversy?
Yeah, let me give you just a little bit of personal history and organizational history. I'm a complementarian. Our church is a complementarian church. I believe that 1 Timothy chapter 2 is clear. And for those who even very recently, in a letter or an article in Baptist Press, one of the churches coming to appeal suggests that Paul's prohibition is related to a specific circumstance there in young Pastor Timothy's church. But 1 Timothy chapter 2 concludes with the reasoning behind male leadership in the church, and it goes all the way back to the doctrine and the order of creation. And I would point out that when Paul says that women are not to serve in authority or to be a teacher of men in the church, he ties it to the order of creation, which is a Genesis 1 and 2 issue. I'm just simply pointing out that's a pre-fall issue. That was part of God's original perfect design. That's not a result of the fall. Therefore, it was not corrected or in any way reversed by the cross. Then you go into 1 Timothy chapter 3, and all of the requirements that are listed there use masculine pronouns, most notably that the pastor must be the husband of one wife. And while there's often been disagreement as to what husband of one wife means, no woman can be the husband of one wife. And if you think that she can be the husband of one wife, you've got bigger doctrinal problems than the complementarian, egalitarian
Yeah.
debate.
Yeah.
And so I believe that the question of biblical fidelity on that issue is clear. I do understand intellectually the arguments that other people make on the other side of the issue, but I think that they are flawed and they ultimately and clearly fail biblically. Now let's fast forward to 2019. When I was serving as the chair of the EC, a motion came to the Birmingham Convention that was referred to the EC, and as an officer, I was one of the first to take it up, that we amend the Baptist Faith and Message to insert the words "and function" into the relevant article of BFM, rather than just saying that the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. It would say that the office and function of pastor is limited to men. I was not in favor of that amendment, in part because I don't think that it's wise to amend your statements of faith to deal with organizational or polity issues. And there's room for honest fraternal debate over that question. But I just didn't think amending the Baptist Faith and Message was the right way to go to deal with that organizational issue. So I was not in favor.
Just to be clear real quick,
Yeah.
Mike, Southern Baptists are not creedalistic.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
the Baptist Faith and Message is not a creed. To be
Correct.
affiliated as a cooperating church with Southern Baptists, you don't have to put your hand on a Bible and swear to we're adhering to every point or exactly to the
Correct.
Baptist Faith and Message. It is
Even
a
our-
confession of faith or a statement of faith. Okay. And so
even our own Constitution does not require total adherence to the latest iteration of the Baptist Faith and Message, in this case,
Right.
the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message. You just got to have a doctrine that is in close alignment with the beliefs and practice as laid out in the Baptist Faith and Message. So I was not in favor of amending that, but something else happened in Birmingham. And just to give you the shortest version, we refashioned and reshaped the Credentials Committee. When the Credentials Committee began to do its work in the late fall of 2019 and early 2020, churches that had women serving as senior pastor, and I'm not talking about a music pastor or a children's pastor or what may be argued to just be a titling issue. I'm talking about a female senior pastor. Some of those churches were referred to the Credentials Committee for potential inquiry and possible disfellowship. There were leading voices on that Credentials Committee who did not think that that was a problem. They said that's a local church autonomy issue, and I would agree. And I want to be very specific and clear. I agree that who a congregation calls to be their pastor is a local church autonomy issue. But again, the Southern Baptist Convention is autonomous in its own sphere and has the right to interpret its own governing documents as it sees fit. I believe that the Baptist Faith and Message was already clear, that that was something that was so distinctive to who we wanted to be as Southern Baptists, that a church would that had a female senior pastor would not meet the criteria, not merely of violating the Baptist Faith and Message, which again is not a requirement for cooperation with the SBC. But I felt that that was such a violation of the Baptist Faith and Message that it would not meet the standard of being in close alignment with, or something that was close to the Baptist Faith and Message. I believe that it was a significant departure from that. When there was debate by some people within the Credentials Committee, I began to believe personally that we did need some form of clarification on that issue, that Southern Baptists could speak to its elected leadership, both at the Credentials Committee and the Executive Committee level. For that reason, I am absolutely in favor of Mike Law's proposed amendment that would amend Article 3 of the Constitution to say that if a church employs a woman as a pastor of any kind, they would necessarily be deemed not in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah, I was going to ask,
Again, that does not infringe on the rights of that local church to determine who they want to be their pastor. If they wanted to have two women serving as co-pastor, I would see that as a violation of Scripture, a violation of the Baptist faith and message. But that church could autonomously decide that's what they want to do. And we literally have no power or authority over that. But we could exercise our own autonomy as a convention by saying, if you do that, you will no longer be considered in friendly cooperation with the SBC. And that's the direction that I think that our convention should go. I am not in favor of the proposal put forward by President Barber that we take this opportunity to have a systemic overhaul of all the governing documents, the Constitution, the bylaws, and have a major revision of the Baptist faith and message. In a lengthy video that he put out on Twitter, he said there are other issues that the BFM could raise. For example, the closeness or the openness of the Lord's table. The Baptist faith and message on its face sure reads to me to be a closed communion document. It is at the very least a close communion document for those who understand the distinction in those words. But I've been going to the Southern Baptist Convention for many years, and I don't recall a debate about whether a church could be in friendly cooperation because they let a non-member who was a baptized believer visiting that night from another church receive the elements off of the communion trays when the deacon passed them across the congregation. That is not an issue that Southern Baptists are facing right now. I think we've got other issues. We've got bigger fish to fry right now than a massive overhaul that would lead to endless and needless debate about how the Baptist faith and message and other governing documents will be revised. Let's deal with
not just debate. I mean, that would be deeply controversial for a lot of people. It wouldn't just be a friendly conversation for the most part.
So let's deal with the issue that the convention is facing, and that is the role of women, not in ministry. The role of women in ministry is not a question. It's not even a question in the Baptist faith and message. But the propriety of women to serve in a pastoral role in a church. That's the question before us. Let's answer it. Let's answer it soundly. And on the point of answering it soundly and clearly, another reason I'm more in favor of a constitutional amendment instead of amending the Baptist faith and message is the BFM can be amended with a simple majority vote at one annual meeting. But the Constitution requires a 2/3 majority at 2 successive annual meetings. And because that's a higher parliamentary threshold, I think doing that sends a stronger statement about where we as Southern Baptists have been and where we as Southern Baptist messengers want the convention to remain. So being a higher organizational or parliamentary threshold, I believe that the constitutional amendment as proposed by Pastor Law is the right course of action for this year's annual meeting. I hope it'll be overwhelmingly passed and then ratified next year when we meet in Indianapolis.
Well, now, Rick Warren at Saddleback has made it very, very clear that they plan to appeal. What do you see is the appeal process for the executive committee's decision to disfellowship not only Saddleback, but there were, I think, 6 or 7 churches total that were kind of in the same category at that point. What is that appeal process, and what does the convention have the authority to do anything beyond that?
Absolutely. The convention always maintains the power and the authority to direct its various entities, in this case, the executive committee. There are actually 3 churches that have notified the credentials committee. There's I think a 30-day, if my memory is correct, they have to notify the convention within 30 days of the convention that they plan to come and appeal. Those 3 churches, 2 of them are going to appeal over the female pastor issue, and another is coming to appeal because they were disfellowshipped on the basis that they did not cooperate with or comply with the inquiry of the credentials committee on a sex abuse issue. And my understanding of that situation is not that they're saying that they had violated the sex abuse issue, but they did not feel that they should be required to participate with some type of inquiry or investigation by the Southern Baptist Convention. As far as how that appeal is going to happen, that's all laid out in Bylaw 8, and viewers can go find that. If you go to sbc.net, scroll down to the bottom of the page, click on Governing Documents, find the bylaws, go to Bylaw 8. That appeals process is set out very, very clearly. And one of the reasons that we vested that initial power when we revised Bylaw 8 we vested the initial authority in the executive committee, predominantly because there are often very specific and deep legal questions. Sometimes there are specific things, and the executive committee can go into executive session and deal with very specific legal issues and avoid needless litigation and controversy in that regard. And so we vested that power in the executive committee, but we also wanted to give that church the right to appeal, because that ultimate power should be vested in the messengers coming to the annual meeting. So at the appropriate time in the order of business, a representative from the church that has been disfellowshipped would be given the privilege of making their argument, and then the convention has an opportunity to speak to that. And I do believe that it should be viewed as a debatable motion, and at some point the convention will have to make a decision. To be clear, these three churches have already been removed from the SBC. So they're not coming to ask to stay in the SBC. They're asking to come to be let back in to cooperation with the SBC, because our governing documents give to the executive committee the authority to declare them out of cooperation. These churches are coming asking for the convention to reverse the action of the executive committee. I would urge, I'm not as familiar with the third case related to complying with the Credentials Committee inquiry, but I would certainly, on the female pastor issue, encourage my fellow messengers to uphold the action of the executive committee, and which would just affirm that these churches are not in cooperation with the SBC. Mr. Bobby, I suddenly cannot hear you. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I do now.
Okay, yeah, I must have bumped
Yeah.
the mute button. So all that good stuff I had to say, see?
All that you've just shared after my question about the credential process.
Yeah, it was so insightful, you know.
I'm sure it was.
In these last minutes, let's try to hit a few more of these questions and try to wrap it up here in the next 15 minutes or so, and we'll see if we can kind of speed through some of these and try to get the rest of them in. John Batts asked about you intentionally building bridges of unity amongst the churches of the SBC. How do you see doing that?
Well, I think that, first of all, doctrinal precision and charting a clear course builds unity in the long run. When I was a candidate for president 2 years ago, I'd already cleared out the first week of August because I wanted to invite the other three brothers who had been nominated. There were a total of 4 of us, as you will remember. I wanted to invite each of us to pick 2 or 3 trusted men who, maybe represented their views, concerns, and vision for the convention, that we would meet maybe at the Dallas airport and just have a couple of days together, fellowshipping and bridge building and seeing how we could come together. And, meetings like that, oftentimes there's a statement that comes out of it. That did not happen. I was not elected. That didn't happen. And I'm not casting aspersions on anyone else for that not happening. But I will tell you that having lost that year by a vote of basically 52 to 48%, there have been no overtures back my way from any person in the Southern Baptist Convention. And the idea of building unity sometimes seems like a one-way street. And those who say we need a really big tent mentality, they seem to want a big tent that only has room for people who hold their particular views, but oftentimes don't have a big enough tent for people who have concerns like mine. I have always demonstrated an ability to work with and cooperate with people who hold different views on our agreed upon doctrines. So under the scope or the umbrella of our governing documents and the Baptist Faith and Message, I have no problem fellowshipping with brothers, even those who strongly disagree with positions that I hold. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who hold the concerns that I have that don't feel that that's reciprocated from those who are currently in places of elected and employed leadership. So you just got to get people in the same room, get them at the same table, create an atmosphere where we can speak respectfully and lovingly, biblically with one another. And because I really do believe there's more that we agree on than that which we disagree on. But that's just going to take leadership that's committed to that effort.
Yeah, no doubt. What do you see now as the primary issues related to the North American Mission Board? What should the normative Southern Baptist Church that average church member in a church out there where you are or some other place in our country, what should they be aware of that's happening with the North American Mission Board right now?
Well, without throwing stones at any particular person, I think that we headed in the wrong direction over a decade ago with the Great Commission Resurgence Task Force recommendations that really created this national entity that handled church planting. I believe the North American Mission Board would tell you that when they plant a church, they want to partner with local churches to do that, have a mothering church or a sponsoring church. But at the end of the day, we have a national entity that is leading the church planting efforts of the Southern Baptist Convention. I think, among other things are healthiest when they begat after their own kind. Dogs that begat dogs, cats begat cats, cows begat cows, and churches should be birthing churches. My own church planted a church 15 years ago or so in a neighboring county. We were the sole sponsor of that church. We had accountability. Two of my deacons regularly worshiped in that church, and they were the primary eyes on the field, so to speak, to see what was going on. So not only do we have what I think is sort of an ecclesiological challenge, but we have an organizational challenge. With some of the things like egalitarian leadership in some of our NAMB-sponsored church plants, I do not personally see evidence that that's because of a blind eye or because of convention leaders who are trying to push egalitarianism. I think it is more likely a result of not having enough eyes on the field to know what's going on in those churches. And that is largely because of just the size and the scope of what we're doing. I'm grateful for church planting. I'm grateful for every Bible-believing church that would be planted with funds from the North American Mission Board. I also think that long-term, we're going to create a problem when we send millions of dollars that are then handed out by a national entity to churches and messengers. If you're not careful, you're going to have bought a voting block at the annual meeting of the convention, and that's just going to not be a healthy thing for the unity and the cooperation. And again, that's not pointing a finger or disparaging anybody. That's an organizational reality. I think we need greater partnership with local churches planting churches. And then there are constantly questions about transparency of finances. I agree that our entities are governed by boards of trustees, and they are by design and by governing documents. They're the first line of defense and accountability. But when you have an organization as large as the North American Mission Board with so many calls for financial transparency, I think it would be a tremendous gesture to create unity, cooperation, and increased investment in our cooperative work as Southern Baptists to simply open the books and present full financial transparency. And that's something not just limited to the North American Mission Board. They get a lot of the attention because of church planting and other things that they're rightly involved in. But I would say that to any of our entities. And we've got that through the business and financial plan of the convention, that any church, any individual could ask for that information. So I'm a big advocate of financial transparency, and while at the same time grateful for the work that they do. I think that the opening the books in that sense would create a greater sense of trust and transparency in the convention.
Well, no, that has been asked for multiple times. We have a number of records where people have said that they, have requested that information, like salary, structures, how much, the people are making who are in the executive positions, that kind of thing at NAMB. Even on the floor in the Nashville annual meeting, one of the pastors did that and asked, and was told that they finally told him when he was calling Alpharetta that he would have to take it to the annual meeting floor because they weren't giving him any more information. And ultimately that didn't result in him getting any more information than he did. So, my question is, when the GCR, the Great Commission Resurgence, was passed, I don't remember there being an actual change of the actual mission of what had been assigned to the North American Mission Board, unless I'm wrong. Their assignment still was church planting, which is fine, evangelism, and there were like those two, maybe a third thing that were in their mission of what they were to be accomplishing. And as Ezell said in an interview with Jimmy Scroggins a number of years ago now, he felt like when he went into North American Mission Board, he had to blow up everything so he could make it like he wanted to make it. And now there's no transparency at all. The people can't find out how their mission monies are being used, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we do if you have an entity? I don't know. I would call it almost rogue if the mission that has been assigned, the mission assignment, I believe is what we call it, from the convention has not changed, yet they're ignoring part of that and have done nothing but the church planting as an emphasis. And of course, they did that initially. They had like 50 staff in Alpharetta helping churches all across the convention. 47,000 churches or whatever had access. And then they eliminated basically all of that evangelism department to have nothing but church planting, eliminated church planting people on the field who were working with associations, community service people, all kinds of other people for church planting. So it seems like just a wrong direction altogether there. And we've gone well beyond 10 years now, and there's basically been no correction. They've kind of dug their heels in. How do we get a change? How do we find out how we can make a change and what needs to be done to get the North American Mission Board back on track?
Yeah, without addressing some of the specific things that you mentioned, I'll just give you the only organizational answer that Southern Baptists have is that these are governance issues that are handled by the various boards of trustees. So then you have to ask, well, how do you change that? If you have any problem, any directional issue with any entity or agency of the SBC, you change that through its governing board. And people are seated on the board when the convention approves the report and the nominations from the nominating committee. The nominating committee is nominated to the convention by the Committee on Committees. The Committee on Committee is singularly and unilaterally appointed by the president. So if you go back to the days of the conservative resurgence, when there were liberalism issues related to our seminaries, denying the doctrines of creation and those sorts of things that were going on, those who investigated our governing document said the way to change it, and I would argue not only the best way, but the only way that any entity kind of issue is changed is by electing a like-minded president who will appoint a like-minded committee on committees that will then nominate a like-minded committee on nominations that will then nominate like-minded nominees that would then populate our various boards of trustees. That's a lengthy process. It's a slow process. 2 years ago, when I was a candidate for president, one brother asked me how long would it take to have change of this nature at any of our entities. And when I said several years, he was angered by that. But that's the only answer that I can give. When we go to New Orleans, we're not electing a Baptist czar or a Baptist pope. We're electing a Baptist convention president who has real authority, but limited authority. And the way that you would bring about those change is find a candidate who shares some of those concerns and is committed to those concerns and seek to have them elected as your next president.
I'd like to wrap up in just a moment with you being able to kind of give a final sales pitch. We'll call it that, a kind of sales pitch, and why you feel like you're the better candidate. And I want to wrap up with that here in just a minute. But let me ask you two other things relative to kind of the NAMB situation as we go. Did you see the deposition notes that were released by NAMB a few days back from the deposition in the McRaney versus NAMB case?
I did not. I've been doing a lot of traveling. I saw a couple of tweets related to that, but have not had a chance to dig down into them.
They didn't release all the pages. There's some pages missing, so that raises my curiosity to start with, but not knowing. But when I was scanning through that, I found this very interesting. I just thought I would get your opinion on this or get your thought. I didn't know if you were even aware of this, but what do you think? That's not the question. Hang on a second. Where did I go? There it is, right there. How do you feel about the SBC mission dollars being used for Ezell to have a security detail at the annual meeting and other significant meetings? Cooperative program dollars are being used for that, and that was addressed in this deposition.
I would say that I'm not in favor of using CP dollars for security details. As to the accuracy of the report or the claim that you just made, I've not seen that, so I'm answering it generally, not specifically.
Sure. Yeah, and that was from Ezell. I mean, that was his conversation, his attorney in the deposition. So
Yeah,
yeah,
just acknowledging I haven't seen
right.
that, but I
I
think
got you.
we've got enough pastor friends that can be around us. Sometimes you need some assistance, somebody who's at a prominent stature, just to
Mhm.
get from one room to another, because so many people want to stop you to share words of encouragement or perhaps
Right.
words of concern. Sometimes you need a handler, so to speak, to say, on your behalf, I'm sorry, we've got to get to this other meeting. But as far as paid security, I would not be in favor of cooperative program funds being used to do that. But I'm not familiar with a specific case that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I had never heard that before either. That was kind of shocking. So I didn't know if you might have been aware, having been at the EC before, on that. Well, let's wrap up with this question. What did you feel were some of the most revealing things that Dr. Chuck Kelly's new book that's coming out, The Best Intentions, has brought to light? The book is talking about the Great Commission resurgence and the best intentions to try to reverse the spiraling decline among Southern Baptists in evangelism, church plants, those kind of things. But the total opposite has basically taken place when you look at the metrics. So what did you pull from that? What did you find most revealing?
Well, I actually was afforded the privilege of having a pre-release copy of that book and writing a brief recommendation for that book.
Mhm.
And I believe my language in that recommendation, and you know how you write just a little paragraph, maybe that would be on the back of a
Right.
dust jacket, that I believe it's a must read for all Southern Baptists. What you see there are just statistics. Now, anytime you look at statistics, somebody else could pull out another statistic to try to show what they think is another side of the equation. But I believe that the overall statistics are showing a very troubling trend numerically for who we are as Southern Baptists. Baptisms were up slightly just a couple of weeks ago when the latest annual ACP numbers came out. They were up slightly, but they're only up over a dismal decline, steady decline. Last year, we lost 457,000 Southern Baptist church
Mm.
members, nearly 500,000. My understanding is that's the largest single membership decline in over a century. Our official number now is down to 13.2 million. And perhaps as troubling as the overall membership number, we lost 416 churches. And if you think it's hard for an individual to get their name off the roll of a Southern Baptist church, it is very hard to get your name off the membership roll, if I could use that. They're technically churches are not
Right.
members of the SBC, but
Right.
just in common vernacular. Once a church gets its name on the membership roll of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is very easy to do, send any money to one of our entities, agencies, or convention calls, and you're in, unless you get kicked out. You've got to actually send a letter to the executive committee and get them to remove your name. So the fact that we have 416 churches that are no longer affiliated or in cooperation with the SBC is a staggering trend in and of itself. Add to that 457,000 individuals. The membership to baptism rates is a very dangerous trajectory that we are on. I do believe that while there are some evangelism initiatives, we have to a large degree put all of our evangelism eggs in the church planting basket. And I think over
Right.
time, we're beginning to see some of the results of that. I would also add very quickly that one of the things I would love to do if elected as president is to help publish and promote an evangelism initiative called Crossover America. Now, I have some more information coming out about that, but I believe that that's the flag we need to be flying, because for all of our controversies and all of our discussions, the thing that will really bring Southern Baptists together, going back to the unity question that someone posed earlier, the thing that I believe we can all rally around is that apart from the saving grace of Jesus that is communicated through the sharing of the gospel, men, women, boys, and girls are lost and on their way to eternity without Christ. And we've got to be busy about spreading the gospel across our nation and around the world. And that's something that I think can be a rallying cry to bring Southern Baptists together.
Yeah, in all my years, especially working with church planting, I always would tell guys, look, the process is pretty simple when you think about it. You evangelize and then congregationalize. If people are being won to the Lord, that's what happened. We see it in the New Testament. Look all through the book of Acts. There were groups of people gathered together who were coming to know Christ, and the natural form that follows after that for maturing disciples and everything else, the community, the worship, everything that you need becomes that local church. And so the evangelize has to be on the front end, just parachuting in somebody to start a church. Even when you bring in a core group, as we say, you still got to be focused on the evangelism. And of course, most of the Southern Baptist Convention are not church plants. And so it kind of narrows the focus, I think, for them. Well, look, let's wrap up with a final question. Do us a favor and kind of give us a good comparison. Why is Mike Stone a better option than Bart Barber? It's very common, in fact, almost historically common, that a president for the Southern Baptist Convention, once elected, it's kind of like he automatically gets elected a second time. He only serves a one-year term, but he kind of automatically serves a second time. Now, you ran a couple of years ago and were nominated and just barely lost in the final, basically the final vote. But you've decided to go again, as you told earlier in the conversation. So why now? Why not wait another year? Why not let Bart Barber have another year? What are the things that you're opposed to and think it's so critical that now is the time?
You use the word critical, and I agree with that word. I also want to use the word unsustainable. And that's not my word. That's a word that the auditors of the SBC Executive Committee gave to describe the financial trajectory of our national corporation. I will hasten to say that I value and support the general precedent that once a man is elected, he would be afforded a second year running unopposed. I think that's a good organizational structure. It allows him, if he has a particular initiative or program that he's trying to push, something he's trying to emphasize, it gives him a second year to do that. It also helps to not have really needless controversy and opposed elections every year. If we could spread that out to every other year, that's a benefit to the Southern Baptist Convention. So I generally affirm that as a wise thing. But these are not status quo times, and this is not the time for status quo leadership. I was not even considering receiving a nomination in New Orleans. Frankly, I was not considering ever receiving a nomination for SBC office ever again until the February meeting of the Executive Committee. And several things came out of that, one of which we've sort of already addressed, but the audit of the SBC Executive Committee was returned as unsustainable. And Brother Bobby, when I say unsustainable, I've been criticized for pointing that out, but that's not the opinion of a Baptist with a Bible. That's the status. That's the report of one of the largest accounting firms in the country, and they're not giving their opinion. They're giving their assessment based on calculators and spreadsheets and calendars that the current financial trajectory of the SBC at the national level, the Executive Committee specifically, is on an unsustainable trajectory, primarily because we have blown through now well over half of our own hand disposable liquid assets because of what I think is the unwise response to this current sex abuse reform. We now, if you read it in Baptist Press, the current interim president of the CEO said that in light of this financial situation, everything is on the table, including the sale of assets. The primary asset that the Executive Committee has is a 7-story building in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. If you want a recipe to make sure that you don't get a good purchasing price, announce to the world that you're trying to sell your building to pay your bills. But even if you do get top dollar for the sale of that asset, that's a non-renewable asset. And when an organization like the SBC Executive Committee is even talking about the sale of real property and the liquidation of assets to pay its bills, that represents an existential crisis and an existential financial threat. Add to that the fact that we're looking at Guidepost Solutions again, and that the staunchest advocate and defender of that position was this current president. I believe that we need a president who will raise these issues, who will actually defend our Southern Baptist Convention. What I mean by that is, from the time I served on the EC and everything that I've seen since, I do not know of a single case of sexual abuse covered up by the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. Certainly that abuse has been covered up by individual churches and individual bad actors in those churches. But I don't know of a single case of sex abuse covered up by the executive committee or by the Southern Baptist Convention. I'll cite somebody who agrees with me on that. This current president made that same statement under oath in a deposition in a Texas courtroom, that he did not know of a single case of sexual abuse covered up by the executive committee or by the SBC. And Brother Bobby, last week in a live stream interview out of Louisiana, when I made that statement that I don't know of a single case of sexual abuse covered up by the convention, it made national headlines. It lit up what we would call SBC Twitter. National publications began running tweets and even some articles about me making what they seemed to think was a preposterous claim. Meanwhile, it's the exact same essential claim that the president of the convention made. Here's a real difference. I've made this claim boldly, clearly, and publicly. I don't have to go into the privacy of a courtroom to defend the actions of our convention. We should be greatly troubled that we cannot get the highest elected and the highest employees of the Southern Baptist Convention to simply defend the convention with the truth. And if I'm elected as the next president, I would appoint a task force. The task force does not have unilateral power. All the task force can do is bring back what I hope to be wiser recommendations to the next year's convention. I don't think that if I come in that I have dictatorial fiat kind of power, but I would put together a task force that would wisely begin to bring different recommendations back to the convention. The convention would have to approve a different pathway of action. But I believe that we have got to get back on a pathway of sustainability. When you have blown through over half of your money in one single year, you don't have to be a mathematician to know, I don't think we have another year. And so because of that trajectory and that unsustainable timeline, I don't believe we have 12 more months to wait. So I think this existential threat calls for a variance from our precedent of allowing a man to serve a second year. And for that reason, I believe the time is right for me to allow my name to go forward in New Orleans.
Okay, so back to the parallel. Bart Barber's our current president. You're wanting to be the president. We're going to have this runoff now between the two of you. What specifically makes you the better choice than him leading us to try to recover from where we have found ourselves over this past year?
Well, the unsustainable trajectory that we're on is not primarily because of the actions of churches or even the executive committee itself. It's because we have received and acted on recommendations that have come from presidentially appointed groups. 3 years of the Sex Abuse Advisory Group under Dr. Greer, the Sex Abuse Task Force under Dr. Litton, and now we're going to be receiving additional recommendations from this current presidentially appointed task force. So you have the power of the platform. Nobody in the convention floor wants to be the one seen as raising their voice or raising their ballot to oppose platform recommendations about sex abuse reform, in part because we all abhor the idea of sexual abuse. Last year in Anaheim, the then chairman of the task force said that the question for Southern Baptists is not what does Guidepost believe about homosexuality. The question, he said, is what do Southern Baptists believe about sexual abuse? I want to respectfully disagree. There is no question about what Southern Baptists think about sexual abuse. And when we've been led to believe that our national agencies have covered it up, we overwhelmingly support radical reform. But to the specific question that you're asking, the task force that I would put together would take the next year to wisely, prayerfully bring recommendations about how we can proceed with a wiser course of action. The convention would have to approve that, but I don't think we've got another year beyond that to stay on this trajectory that we're on. So the task force is a major point of distinction. Also, we've had resolutions coming out of the Resolutions Committee that I think present troubling statements on this, that create needless legal jeopardy and liability. The Resolutions Committee is directly appointed by the president. So I would appoint a task force and a Resolutions Committee that would begin to give more biblically sustainable statements and recommendations for the convention to approve. Those are the two key distinctions as it relates to distinguishing me from Bart. I would also point out in conclusion, Brother Bobby, that the day that I was announced as an upcoming nominee, I was privileged to make a call to Bart and to share with him my love for him, my appreciation for him, and to tell him that I have no desire to disparage him personally. I consider him as a brother in the Lord. We just have some fundamental differences about the way that we should be approaching a couple of the key issues that we're facing right now in the SBC. And I'll leave it here to say I've been criticized by some for not criticizing him personally. I actually think that we need to have brotherly, and in some cases, brother to sister or sister to sister conversation that honors one another, that doesn't seek to misrepresent or malign each other, but just to have an argument or a debate about ideas and let the Southern Baptist Convention decide which direction it wants to go. I will tell you, the direction that we are on, the financial experts say it is unsustainable. And I believe that it's largely because some of the actions we're taking are indeed not sustainable biblically. And through the presidential appointments that I would seek to help us bring recommendations to change the direction of the convention.
Pastor Mike Stone, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we've stayed a little longer than what we'd planned, but I appreciate your time today in sharing with us your view and your vision for what we need to do as a convention. Any final word you'd want to say?
I'll just say if these concerns of mine resonate with you, if you agree that unsustainable should be unacceptable, Facebook posts and likes and links and thoughts and prayers will not elect the next president of the convention. If you want to change this direction, if my thoughts resonate with you, you've got to get to New Orleans, register as a messenger June 13th and 14th. Presidential election is the afternoon of the 13th. And I would encourage you to go. Cast your ballot in the election of president and stay in the room until a president is announced. There's always the possibility of the third candidate and therefore a potential runoff. But Southern Baptists have proved that in a way that perhaps only we can. We can have two candidates and neither one of them get a majority because of a little parliamentary snafu we had back in 2016. So my closing word would be, if you're concerned about the things that I've voiced today, get to New Orleans, register as a messenger, vote in the office of president, and the other business that would be before the convention. Stay in the room as long as you can, certainly until a president is announced. And let's move forward together, cooperating as Southern Baptists.
All right. Thank you again, Pastor Mike Stone. We appreciate it. Anyone who's watching, we're going to be interviewing Bart Barber tomorrow at 1 o'clock, just like we have today with Pastor Mike. We look forward to that conversation as well. All right. Have a good day.